Hello, everybody. I'm Carla Millette. I direct the Islamic Studies program here at the University of Michigan. And I'd like to begin by gratefully acknowledging the support of the Penny Stamps Distinguished Speaker Series for this talk. Those of us who study medieval culture learn that the fresco programs in medieval churches often were designed to teach the unlettered by using images to tell the stories and to teach the truths, to represent the truths that are contained in sacred texts and popular traditions. And illustrations in children's books, in modern children's books, play largely the same role. They lead the audience to visualize the events that are described in the books. Whether you're literate or not, the illustrations help to interpret the story that you're reading or hearing, depending on your level of access. And of course, they bring an element of delight to the reading experience. So building on these traditions of illustration and illumination, Sandow Birk's American Qur'an project aims to both teach and delight. But more than an illustration of the sacred text, American Qur'an is a visual translation of the message of the Qur'an. It's accompanied by a verbal interpretation. There should be copies of it outside, by the way. Have they arrived? Did you see them coming in? Look for them when you go. There should be a couple of copies of the text itself, as well as some copies of the equally fabulous Inferno, also illustrated by Sandow Birk. The American Qur'an is accompanied by a verbal interpretation of the text, a representation of the meanings of the Qur'an in contemporary vernacular English. Like that verbal translation, Sandow's illustrations are what translation scholars would call a domesticating translation, right? In the sense that they bring the text closer to the audience. They encourage us to see how the words of the Qur'an communicate with the here and now. We see images of a jogger, for instance. We see workers sitting at computers. We see a taco truck. We see a bank of surveillance cameras. We see the countryside and the city. We see holidays and banal everyday scenes. A man fixes a flat tire on one page. On another, we see a city street with Spanish, Vietnamese, Persian, Chinese, and Hebrew signage. On others, we see representations of holidays, Jewish holidays, Christian holidays, Muslim holidays. In some cases, the images are more pointed. Quranic references to the violent forces that can transform our physical world, like earthquakes, hurricanes, and floods, are accompanied by images that recognizably reflect the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina in the American South. Some images represent Muslim countries under American occupation. In one, an advertisement in Arabic above a closed shop promotes Dajjaj Kintaki alongside Colonel Sanders' smiling face. Others depict desert landscapes with military personnel and equipment. In all these cases, Sandow's illuminations respond to hints given in the text. Like the medieval fresco cycles, they interpret the content of the text. They help us to place the Qur'an in an American landscape. And like the illustrations in children's books, they occupy an intimate space. We hold the book in our lap, face to face with text and image, and another world intersects with our own. They interpret the text for a new audience, for Muslims curious to see how the Qur'an refracts and ripples when handled by an artist who comes to it from outside the religious tradition, and by non-Muslims curious to see the sacred text put into contact with an American sensibility. American Qur'an is the product of 10 years of work. Years spent traveling, studying Islamic art, studying manuscripts of the Qur'an, studying the text itself. It's the work of a very serious artist who doesn't shy away from difficult subjects and who isn't afraid to push deep into the contemporary resonance and political readings of the sacred text. Sandow's received numerous grants and awards in the course of his career, some of them to support this project, including an NEA International Travel Grant to Mexico City, a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Fulbright Fellowship, a Getty Fellowship, a City of Los Angeles Fellowship. He has been artist in residence at the Smithsonian Institute in Washington, D.C., and the Cité Internationale des Arts in Paris. His dedication to his project, his insight and visual imagination produce exhilarating results in the American Qur'an, a work that is at once deeply respectful and exuberantly vernacular. Please join me in welcoming Sandow Birk.
Wow. I think you should do the talk. You're better at it than I am. Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm really happy to be here. I'm happy to be here because I actually was born in Detroit, and I moved to California when I was 6 years old, and I've never been back here. So it's sort of a homecoming to me. I'm sort of a native son returned or something. My father worked for Ford when I was a little kid, and then he got a job working for Toyota, which has its headquarters in Los Angeles, and we moved there when I was in kindergarten, and I've never been back. So it's nice to be here. Thank you. I'm an artist from Los Angeles. I'm going to talk to you tonight about this project, a 9-year project that, in which I illustrated and transcribed an English version of the Qur'an, every single page. And I'm going to give you a little bit of background. The two questions right off the bat, the two questions I'm always asked about this project is, number one, why did I do it? And number two is, are people mad at me? So just to get those out of the way right away, no one's mad at me. A few people have been surprised when they hear about it, but almost always once they see it, they're intrigued. And the project has been shown in small segments over the past 6 or 8 years all around the United States. And the only negative response it's gotten has been anonymous emails to some of the galleries saying that Americans shouldn't waste their time reading the Qur'an, we shouldn't be teaching the Qur'an, and we should take the show down. But a little bit of background. I grew up in the suburbs of Los Angeles. I've been a surfer since I was 11 years old, and I still surf all the time, and it has something to do with this project, which you'll see. I went to the Otis Art Institute in downtown Los Angeles. I did an exchange year in Europe where I studied French painting, French revolutionary painting, and romantic painting. When I first got out of school, I was doing these enormous paintings of surfing. And part of my whole way of working has been to look at historic artworks and sort of readapt them and think about historic artworks can be updated and have something to say about our own times. When I got out of school, I was living in South Central LA because I was an artist and I was poor and broke. I was working part-time in art galleries and painting at night. And I was painting the surfing that I did in the daytime and painting the neighborhood I was living in at night. This was in the 90s, sort of the rise of hip-hop and gang culture was going on in Los Angeles. So I was doing these reinterpretations of classical painting into contemporary scenes. This is my painting of the Los Angeles Riots in 1992. And I also carried on and started to play with the idea of, the tradition of history painting, as they said in Europe in the old days, the genre of history painting, which is sort of outdated. But I thought, what if we made history paintings now? Is it possible? Is it reasonable? So this is my painting of O.J. Simpson being arrested in his driveway in Brentwood. But jumping 15 years later than these paintings, I was invited by an art school in Maui in Hawaii to come and do a print project there. The printer was Paul Maloney. He'd done printmaking in San Francisco for 10 years. He'd gone to Japan for 10 years, and now he's back in San Francisco. But he called me and invited me to come to this art school in Hawaii to do a print project, and I said, I really don't know anything about prints. I never studied them. I never made prints when I was in school or anything. And he said, that's fine, just come out here and see if we can get a project going. So I went to Hawaii, and like I always do, I started going back through art history and looking at the history of print, and stumbled on a series of little tiny etchings by Jacques Callot that were called The Miseries of War. And they were done 200 years before Goya's famous war prints of the Spanish War. And these were little tiny etchings about the 30 Years' War in Belgium. And from those, Paul and I and a team of his assistants embarked on a 2-year project to do a whole series of prints all about the war in Iraq. This was when George Bush was president and the war in Iraq was just getting going. And I was quite upset about the war in Iraq. And so for those 2 years, spent a lot of time, almost every day, just following the news, working on this project, reading about the current events and working on this project. The way we would do it was I would go with my wife, who's also an artist. We'd go to Hawaii for a few weeks and carve these enormous wood blocks out of pieces of plywood. Then we'd go back to Los Angeles and I would paint paintings, and then we'd go back to Hawaii and do a few more. And it took 2 years to do the whole series. So over the course of these 2 years, really listening to the American discourse about 9/11 and the invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan and the earlier invasion of Iraq after Kuwait and all that, and just really listening to all this public debate going on in the radio and television and everything, and this whole idea was going around was, is Islam somehow fundamentally at odds with Western civilization? Is Islam something that doesn't mesh with the American way of life? All these sort of things, and the more I was listening to this, the more I sort of started to realize that being a lifelong surfer, I travel a lot to go surfing, and I realized that over the course of my life, I think I had traveled on 10 long trips to different Islamic parts of the world. And the trips that I had had to these places, and the way that people were talking about Islam, that they were nothing alike. And my personal experiences of having been in Islamic parts of the world were nothing at all like the way people were talking about it. And at some point, I just decided, I'm sick of listening to people talk about what Islam is. I'm going to see for myself. And I went down to the bookstore and bought a copy of the Qur'an. And this was while we were finishing up this project. So this is the execution of Saddam Hussein. And as I said, I went back to LA in the middle of this project and was working on paintings at the same time. This is my ironic painting called The Liberation of Baghdad, which is meant to show what we were told was to happen when the Americans rolled into Baghdad and the happy, liberated people would come running out with chocolates and flowers to greet us. This was my painting, The Riddle of the Sphinx. As the war went on and on, the question after the 7 or 8 years of war were less about whether you're for the war or against the war. The whole discussion started to be about, now we're stuck in this war, how does America get out of this war? And it seemed to be sort of the eternal question of politics in the Middle East. My studio where I live in Los Angeles now is around the corner from an Army recruiting storefront. And I walk by it every day and I see high school kids in there, and especially back when the war was really going on. And I used to go by every day and I just wonder, what are those kids thinking? Signing up for the Army in the middle of this war. Are they imagining they're going to go off to exotic places and see camels and beautiful girls and things? So this is my painting called The Soldier's Dream. And this is my painting riffing on Norman Rockwell's famous painting of the soldier coming home from World War II in the Italian neighborhood in Brooklyn, and the whole family's running out to see him. This is a soldier returning to a housing complex in South Central LA to a much different reaction from his friends and neighbors. So I said, I went out and got a copy of the Qur'an and started reading it, and like I said, I had traveled to all different places to go surfing. This is Java in Indonesia. This is a mosque in Java that I had been near. This is surfing in Indonesia. This is a mosque in Mindanao in the Philippines. My wife is half Filipino, and we've been to the Philippines to visit her family. This is surfing in the Philippines, where we spent a month. This is Tangiers in Morocco. This is surfing in Morocco. This is me and a friend in Casablanca in Morocco, outside the largest mosque in Africa, which you can surf right in front of. So I was continuing to travel. I'm reading the Quran. I'm pondering these things, these current events for 2 or 3 years. I'm sort of learning the Quran on my own, and I start looking at historic Quranic manuscripts from the library, getting coffee table books, flipping through them, and really looking at these beautiful historic manuscripts, and gradually starting to get this idea of trying to make an illuminated manuscript of the Quran. But every time I would look at these historic things, I would get really depressed and say, you know, they're so beautiful, they're so amazing, there's no way that I could ever do anything that wouldn't just be a farce in comparison, that I kept sort of putting the idea aside and looking at these things and pondering and looking. And then while I was on yet another surfing trip to Ireland this time, I found myself wandering around Dublin one rainy afternoon and almost by accident just stumbled on the Chester Beatty Library in Dublin. I went inside and they had 1,000 years of Qur'an spread out in glass cases. It turns out they have the second largest collection of Qur'ans in the whole world outside of Egypt, and they're all there in Dublin. And suddenly I was looking at them, and suddenly these amazing things that I was looking at in books, and I thought they were just so perfect and amazing. Suddenly when you were looking at them in real life and seeing them up close, you could see that there's like little mistakes, and they had gone out of the lines, and they had erased parts and fixed things. And suddenly these sort of amazing, immaculate things seemed to be more charming and more handmade and more real. And right then I just decided that I'm going to go ahead and make a Quran of my own. So I did. I originally thought it would take me 3 or 4 years. It ended up taking 9 years. But what I did is I started out taking sort of the template or the historic formation of historic Qurans with the big borders, with the margin decorations, with the palmettes that mark the end of each verse, the colors of the inks of the title blocks. And I made that template and I started going through the Quran and transcribing every page in English and illuminating it with scenes of life in America that suggested themselves to me through the text. This is Surah 4. It's a long surah that goes on and on about different rules for society. So my scene is of a funeral. So the idea was to take the Quran and put alongside it metaphorical images of life in our times that went along with the text. And this is one of the most obvious ones, but this is a long passage that talks about Noah's Ark. And so you can see now it's the flood of Katrina in New Orleans, and you see all the waters actually flooding out of the framework of the page, and people are wandering through the flood. This is another passage about Noah building the ark. It shows a man building a canoe in his driveway in Seattle or something. The idea that I had was, when I began the project, was to sort of stop listening to what the people were telling me Islam was about and open the Quran and read it and take it for what the Quran says that it is, that it's a message from God that's coming down from the sky and it's coming to all human beings on the planet. And I thought, well, I'm a Californian living in Los Angeles in the 21st century. What does this message mean to me? How does it relate to my daily life? This is a scene of Adam and Eve being made into a movie in Hollywood. And the Quran, if you don't know the Quran, it often mentions over and over again throughout the text that this is a message coming down from God. So a lot of the images I have are about the way messages are coming down from the sky. This is a guy putting up a TV antenna. Telephone repairmen. So I use images about how messages are spread around in the 21st century. Another way that messages are spread are by graffiti writers that tag trains that then go off across the countryside. Another graffiti writer to go along with the surah called The Pen. This is a newspaper distribution center where they're folding the newspapers to go out in the morning. Another way that we disperse information. A TV talk show. And this is to go along with a passage about those that deny the message. It shows a guy cleaning up graffiti and erasing it from the walls. Much of the message of the Quran talks about that God is watching us all the time. So I have lots of images of surveillance cameras all around the borders, and then insets of little scenes of views of a bank and a liquor store. This is a passage about the burning bush, Moses and the burning bush. And I don't know if I'm talking to people that are familiar with the Quran or not, but if you have no idea what the Quran is and you pick it up like I did and start reading it, the first thing that hits you is that the Quran is remarkably familiar. It's the story of Adam and Eve, Noah's Ark, Abraham and Isaac, Moses, Jesus and Mary. It's all the same stories that you might be familiar with from the Bible. This is quite a long passage in the Quran about Moses, in which he goes down a river with Al-Qadir. Besides images that are sort of directly metaphorical, I have lots of images of sort of the mundaneness of life in America, because I was thinking about how, well, I should say I'm not a religious person. I'm not really a believer. My parents did drag me to Presbyterian church up until I was 8 or 9 years old and could resist. But I'm familiar that when you go to church or go to a mosque, the way that it sort of goes is the priest or the padre or whatever will open the Bible, read you a paragraph or two, close it, and then sort of go off into a sermon about how does this passage relate to your life. And so what happens when you leave the church or the mosque or the temple is you're going on your way home and you're stopping at the ATM machine in the supermarket, or you're maybe going to your boring cubicle job, and your brain is full of all these thoughts about the afterlife and spirituality. And so sort of this personal struggle of spirituality is going on inside of your head at often the most mundane times of our lives. This is another mundane image, but it also goes along with the passage about Moses going down the river in the raft when he's a baby. This is the chapter called Mary, about Mary, mother of Jesus. And I happen to live in a Mexican neighborhood in LA where many of the stores are decorated with scenes of the Virgin of Guadalupe. Many passages of the Quran talk about sort of threatening that we've all know how God wiped out the world with Noah's flood, and he's capable of doing it again. And the signs of earthquakes and tornadoes are signs of God's anger with us. And here on the bottom, this is a multiple page surah or chapter, and it has insets that show the cycle of life from baby to old man. Another thing I started to do as I went on with the project over the years was I decided to try to include an image of every one of the 50 states in the United States. This is a scene of an earthquake in San Francisco, a hurricane in Florida, a tornado in the Midwest, destroying a Piggly Wiggly store. Another California earthquake. Other messages and passages in the Quran talk about how one way that we can believe that the Quran is true and that God is speaking the truth is that we can travel around and we can see the remnants of previous civilizations that have come before us and that now no longer exists. So I have scenes of travel, and this is, you can see, is a flight to Mexico City, and then on the next page it's a scene of the Aztec pyramids. These are the remnants of the Pueblo Indians in New Mexico. a civilization which has sort of disappeared. And Dinosaurs in the Field Museum in Chicago, another example of how we see things that have come and now no longer exist. And excavation, archaeology, looking at previous civilizations. This is a scene that goes along with a long surah about the story of Joseph, who wanders around the desert for a long time and has all kinds of adventures. But I paired it along with a scene of Mexican immigrants trying to sneak across the border in Arizona. And you see them hiding here behind the rocks while the Border Patrol looks for them. And another scene of immigrants being rounded up by immigration in the desert. This chapter is about divorce. It lays out the rules for divorce and how people can get divorced and how the women should be treated and how they should divide up their things. This is Surah 24. This has the passages that are often interpreted to mean that women should wear the veil, depending on how you interpret it. So I thought, well, who in the United States wears the veil and why? And so I have a scene of a snowstorm in Chicago and people all bundled up. A passage that talks about how we should be kind to orphans and treat the poor and to widows and how we should help the destitute, to go along with the image of Skid Row. And this is, on the far left, this is the house that I grew up in Pontiac, Michigan. So they have little personal things inside. This is a scene of people being rousted by the cops to go along with passages about judgment and judgment day is coming and that we need to be prepared at all times. And another to go along with the warning that death can come at any time, so you should always be prepared. This is another passage that talks about the final judgment day coming, that you could die at any moment, and also the idea that life comes from a drop of blood. And another page that shows the cycle of life from a woman with an infant on the far right to an old man in a bed on the left, and butterflies around the edges because they have such a short lifespan from cocoon to death. More scenes of life and death in America. Surah 5, the table, goes on at length about which foods are permitted to be eaten. And part of it says that foods that you kill yourself are good for you. So there's a scene of duck hunting. And this is another passage about foods that are good for you and that we know that God is good because he sends the rains down which nourish the earth, which grow the crops, which give us life. But for myself, living in the city, where I get my food is the grocery store. The Qur'an is interesting in all kinds of different ways. That could be all kinds of different discussions, but it's interesting, as its role in the world. It's interesting as a document, the fact that it's always been the same for 1,300 years, the fact that there's certain symbols appear in it that they don't know what they mean. It's also a book or a message that assumes that you're smarter than the Bible does. Whereas the Bible is a narrative that sort of tells you this is what happened from the day one when the earth was formed, and goes in sequence and tells you all the way up to the life of Jesus. The Quran assumes that you already know the Bible. The Quran sees itself as being the extension of the Bible, and so it often refers to these stories and says, oh, well, it's like that story of Moses that you already know about, or it's like the Noah's Ark story that you're already familiar with. So you have to bring more to it. It's also, it was constantly fascinating to me. I worked on it for so many years, and despite it just taking so long, it was amazing. It's an amazing thing to work with and to learn about, and I found every day that I spent with it, I learned more. And one example was reading passages about this, and they start talking about the Battle of the Trench, which I had never heard of, but it's a decisive battle in Muhammad's life. And this is a page talking about it in which I show people working in a trench. But I start reading about the Battle of the Trench, and it's sort of mentioned in passing, and then you can go to Wikipedia and you can read page after page of it, and you start to see maps of the battle, and then you can go to Google Earth and see the actual places where it occurred. And so the Quran is like an onion, where every page everything that you learn, you have to learn more, and you have to dig deeper and deeper. And so it's fascinating. The Battle of the Trench, the turning point was when one side had a really big brigade, or whatever they're called, of archers up on a hill, and because they had archers, it was able to turn the tide of the battle. And that's discussed on this page. Well, it's not discussed so much as alluded to. Another one of the important passages in the Quran tells the story of the men in the cave, in which 7 men go into a cave and fall asleep, and when they wake up, it's 100-some years later, and then they come out and the whole world has changed. It's sort of a retelling of the Rip Van Winkle idea. And in my project, I found the best pages it worked best when I was able to take something that's really meaningful in the Quran and put it along with something that's meaningful that was happening today. And so my scene shows the miners trapped in the Upper Big Branch mine in West Virginia, which was happening at the time I painted it. And you see the 7 of them trapped underground there with the dog. And the dog appears in the Quranic passage, I believe. Like I said, this project began, the initial spark was the war in Iraq. This surah is called Spoils of War, and it talks about some of the rules of warfare. And I went and looked up what American corporations most have benefited from the war in Iraq. And number 1 was Mobil. So they're depicting the spoils of war. And here's a scene of the Americans occupying Islamic lands, the American troops. This is in Baghdad. And this is Guantanamo Bay, Camp X-Ray. And this is another sort of important part of the Quran in which it uses a metaphor to talk about a battle in which one side came riding in with elephants, and they had the overwhelming force and were able to win the battle because they had such better weaponry. In the Quran, it's elephants, but in the case of the Americans invading Iraq, it's superior weapons. And carrying on in the Quranic story, birds come along and they drop pebbles onto the troops. So the whole border is done with birds. If you don't know the Quran, one of the interesting things about it is the earliest copy of the Quran that they have is been put together about 40 years after Muhammad's life. And it's all been put together, and the chapters are arranged from the longest to the shortest in general, and nobody really knows why they're that way. They do know when each chapter was revealed to Muhammad, or when he spoke them, and the book is not in the sequence of how he spoke them. So the much earlier chapters of the Quran deal more with social issues, and then as it gets towards the end, they become sort of more metaphorical. And this is Surah 100 out of 114 in the Quran, and this is a short passage that has a sort of poem semi-metaphorical description of a herd of camels charging. And being a Californian, I have no idea what a herd of camels charging is like, but I tried to imagine something that gives that sort of awe with the roar of stock car races. This is a show of the project when it was halfway finished at Grinnell College in Iowa. My original idea for the project was to make an entire illuminated book, all entirely done, bind the whole thing and put it on a pedestal and it would be done. And I went to the galleries that I work with and they said, well, that's a great idea, but it's going to take you many years, and how do we have any income during those years? And it just didn't seem to be practical at all. So the practical way I did it was I would do about 40 pages at a time, and then we would frame them up, the pages, and have a show of them at my galleries. I have a gallery in Los Angeles, another in San Francisco, and one in New York. And I would rotate the shows every year over about 7 years, and then bring it all together at the end. So when it was going to be finished, the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh wanted to do a big show of it, and that was going to be the first venue for it. And a couple years ago, they called up and said, uh-oh, we had a show scheduled and it fell through. Can we do your show now? And I said, well, I'm not finished with the show. And they said, well, whatever you got, let's do a show of it. So they took about half of the project and made a show of it. And that show, when it was halfway done, traveled around to several places, and this is one of them. In every time that I've shown the project, which has probably been up to near 10 or 12 times now in different forms, but it was just, the book itself was recently finished. It was published in November, and also in November opened the whole final exhibition of the project at the Orange County Museum of Art in Southern California. So it had about 230 painted pages, along with several other artworks. In every showing of the project, I've included what's called a Mihrab. And a Mihrab is what you find inside of mosques, or if you travel in the Muslim world, you find them in people's homes or inside hotel rooms. And they're usually a decorative ceramic piece, and it's on the wall, and it shows you which way to face for Mecca during prayer time. The traditional shape of them is a niche. So again, as I always did, I started thinking, well, as Americans, what sort of niche do we deal with? What niche is familiar to Americans? And I decided an ATM machine. And so working with my wife, who's a ceramic artist, we made a full-size ATM machine. And all around it has verses from the Qur'an that I chose that were meaningful to me. In this case, always be just, be true to every promise, truly with hardship comes ease, and be modest in your bearing. Also, throughout this project, at the very beginning of the project, I'm very aware of how important calligraphy is in traditional Islamic artworks. So I thought to myself, again, who in the United States does calligraphy? Who most thinks about calligraphy? And immediately I thought, graffiti writers. They spend all day thinking about letters and how to bend them and shape them. And so the lettering that I used here was sort of a simplification of Los Angeles street graffiti, simplified to make it more legible. And the same with all the titles and things. This was the Mihrab as it was shown in New York in the Gallery I show at, PPOW. When the Orange County Museum called and said they're ready to put the whole show together into a really big show in the museum, which is a large museum, my wife and I got together and decided to make the Mihrab more spectacular. So this is my wife Elise working on, we extended the Mihrab. And there you see it on the far end of the wall there at the Orange County Museum. And these are some paintings I did. This is another Mihrab. This has a really beautiful passage from the Quran. Whoever saves the life of another surely saves the lives of all humanity. And here it says God in English, and then these 4 palmettes are metaphors for God in Arabic. My wife made a surveillance camera to be watching over the gallery, and it says God on the lens. So back to the original, people always ask, are people mad at me? And the answer is no, as I said. This is a scene of one day in the gallery in New York at PPOW when people were just looking at the paintings and it happened to be prayer time. And so they used the Mihrab to find the direction of Mecca. And this is the book. They did a fantastic job. The book has come out in November. It's published by W.W. Norton, and they were able to create the whole manuscript at the same scale as my paintings. So it's a massive book. It weighs 12 pounds. And it's available now on Amazon and in bookstores, and it's quite affordable. I think it's $62 on Amazon for a 400-page book. And that's what I've brought to show you today. So. I'd be happy to talk further about it if you steer me with questions. Yes?
First of all, I'd like to thank you for making it. I learned a lot about the Qur'an and American culture as well. My question is, how did you select the translation?
That's also a frequent question. I don't speak Arabic. I read it in English, obviously. And when I was working on the project, I read probably 6 or 8 translations. My favorite was Thomas Cleary because of its simplicity. The most informative was Muhammad Asad. But as an artist, I've published previous books. I did a whole project about the Divine Comedy. And so I know that, and I knew and I foresaw that I would have trouble using their translations. And so the actual translation I mostly used was R.M. Rodwell from 1861 because it's copyright free. And of course, people nowadays say, oh, you should call up Muhammad Asad and ask him to let you use his translation. And the reality is, 9 years ago, if I had called up Muhammad Asad and said, hey, I'm this guy in California, I'm going to do an illustrated Qur'an, would you let me use your thing? I don't think he would have been very happy. In hindsight, it seems like it would have been easier. Yes?
Thank you. Thank you for coming. I know you mentioned that people weren't really mad at you for doing this, but can you talk more about your passage? I believe it was Smoke, where you depicted the scene of 9/11.
Sure, I do have a scene of 9/11. It was omitted from this by mistake. It's a scene from the street, and you can see the buildings in the distance, and in the foreground are people sort of lamenting it. I wanted to include a scene of 9/11 and the buildings collapsing because, well, number one, it was the spark of the idea, but also I think it's impossible to have a discussion of Islam in the United States without mentioning 9/11. So to not include it would just be a mistake. So I included it, and yeah, it's in there. Yes, in the back?
Thank you so much for such a great presentation. I love looking at the artwork. My question has to do with how people have interacted with these paintings. In particular, were you hoping or anticipating that they would read what is on them, or just sort of apprehend it as a whole by looking mostly at the images?
Yeah. No, the idea that, like I said, the idea that I had was, the dream was to make a manuscript. And the ideal form of the project to me is the book, which now exists and which now you can buy. And so, it's meant to be slowly read and pondered as a book would be. It's a little problematic as an art show because people tend to read a little bit and then they get bored and skip to the next one. But that's fine. The art show. You can see the original paintings, but the real final product is the book in my head. Yes? I don't know what you mean ambivalence.
Well, like something that you back as it wasn't so easy for you to find things or conflicts in the American culture. Something that actually created tension in your own process of creating your American world.
I mean, often it's complex. It was, it was hard to put into a nutshell because it was so many years, and also as I went along, I sort of got smarter and more familiar with the text and understood it more. So it was sort of a learning process as I went. And I think also at the beginning of the project, I wasn't really sure how it would come out, or if it was feasible, or if I would give up halfway through, or if anyone would ever see it. And then as it started to go, when I was like halfway through, I started to think, well, I was more confident in what I was doing. I was showing it to more people. I started to work with a couple of mentors at Cornell, Islamic scholars that were enthusiastic about it, and I was able to email them with questions and go back and forth, discuss things with them. But yeah, there were, at certain passages, gave me immediately an idea of what it should be, like the Noah's Ark passages. And then other passages were much more metaphorical or vague and more spiritual, and then it was harder to come up with images that went with them.
Pointed version of that. I'm glad no one is angry at you, and I'm very grateful that you came and showed us these images. Seeing figurative art juxtaposed so closely with the Quran is uncomfortable for quite a lot of people, I think. I mean, I've heard Professor Gray Wallace speak about it, and so I know that is out there as a what for me is a really interesting but somewhat dissonant aspect of the project, and I just wonder. If you could maybe speak more directly to that this is not a project that would be done within an Islamic country, I think.
Well, it hasn't been done, but actually I was with some Islamic scholars yesterday, and they were so excited, and they said, I think this is going to open the floodgates. You're going to see this start happening all over now that you broke the ice or something, which I don't know if that's true or not. But yeah. I guess another way to rephrase what you're saying is people say, I thought there's a ban against putting images with words in Islam. And the answer to that is technically no, there isn't. There's nothing in the Quran that says you can't. There's nothing anywhere that says you can't. And it's sort of something that historically has ebbed and flowed. In the earlier days of Islam, there was more images, and then there was less, and then there was more and less. And on Saturday, I was at the Asian Art Museum in San Francisco speaking, and one of the scholars there pointed out that Christianity has had the same thing. He said in Amsterdam in the 1500s, they tore out all the icons from their church, and there was a time when they were against having images, and now it's back having images, and it's the ebbs and flows. But yeah, another part of this project, which your question reminds me to speak on, is I often get asked, where did you go in the Middle East? And my answer is that I've never been anywhere in the Middle East. And there's this assumption, I think, generally among Americans, that the Quran is something that's so tied to the Middle East. And I think this project is meant to question that. I say, if I went to Texas A&M and said I spent 9 years studying the Bible and I'd never been to the Middle East, no one would think that that's necessary. The Bible is seen as a message, although it's a book from the Middle East, it's not seen as tied to the Middle East. The Bible is seen as a universal message that can reach people in Korea or, Peru. And statistically, I think 82% of Muslims have never been to the Middle East either. 80% of Muslims live in Southeast Asia, in tropical places, and Americans immediately think Islam, they think the desert, they think camels. They don't think the jungles of Java, where the biggest Muslim country in the world is. And so, my project is to point that out, I think. I know the restrictions on using images are from one part of the world, but they're not the same in Jakarta or in Singapore or in other places that are quite liberal. Yeah?
For someone in a different country, a Middle Eastern country, who like to see pictures of America juxtaposed to something that they're familiar with. Like, there could be translations of the text that could be sold in other countries. Would you be interested in that?
Would I be interested in showing it in the Middle East?
No, like this book being translated into a different...
Into Arabic?
Right, and...
Sure.
No,
yeah.
I mean, like Arabic text, but people would, see the pictures of American life.
Sure. And, the same thing has been done to the Bible forever, from Jesus Christ Superstar, the play where it sets the Bible in New York in 1970s. And so this is not a new idea in Christianity. And depicting it in your own times, yeah. And other statistics are interesting. I think only 12% of Muslims speak Arabic. So the vast majority of Muslims read the Qur'an in their own language and translation as well, even though the Qur'an in its original form is in Arabic. Yes?
They're fantastic. I know you said you included them when you show parts of the show, but can you talk a little bit more about how that came about?
What do you mean? I mean, we wanted to include a Mihrab just out of respect inside the gallery so that people visiting would have a Mihrab in the space. And then the thinking went through what sort of niches are we familiar with and led to us making ATM machines.
There was a time it may have been a paper.
Yeah. In the back, yeah? Yeah, I mean, it's all speculation. We're imagining a fictional person that I have never met that is upset about it at this point. So what reason? I don't know. The ones that I've met didn't seem to have any trouble with it, I think you think about, in Saudi Arabia, women can't drive cars, but in Singapore, women can drive cars. So maybe... I don't live in a place where it's not allowed to put pictures with images. It's sort of what my occupation is as an artist. So.
Thank you. These are essentially your, should I say, opinion, or your feelings and understanding of the Qur'an visually.
Sure, it's all my own interpretations, yes.
Right, and for example, the Mihrab that you have with the ATM thing has a certain humor associated with it. Did you intentionally put a certain amount of humor in your illustrations and visual aspects of the Quran?
Sure. I also see the whole project as being a real vehicle for my paintings to criticize America, from our invading countries to our obsession with ATM machines. It's the country I know best, so I feel safe in criticizing it.
Correct, but you used somewhat of a sacred vocabulary and imagery to criticize United States, in your opinion, in your statement. But as an overall idea, about, I don't know, maybe 20 years ago or so, an author, Salman Rushdie, you might know,
Yes.
said essentially less than a paragraph. That wasn't even, in my opinion, wasn't anything to it that would have been insulting or what questionable and so forth. And he had a fatwa on his neck. So you haven't gotten any of that yet.
No,
That's
I
good.
have not. Yes?
I have a question about when you look at the book, especially when you look at
The earlier surahs where there's long surahs and there's lots of words, it doesn't read like a normal illuminated manuscript in the sense that sometimes it seems that what we see are images where you can't see. There are important parts of the images that are behind text. So did you, sort of plan, looking at this, you can
Yeah.
see enough of the people to read what's going on, but in some cases, important parts of the images are obscured, which is not like, in a sort of a medieval manuscript, it would all be carefully kind of choreographed, right, to avoid that effect. Were you playing with the kind of the overlaying of text and image when you were designing it in your mind, or was there a certain amount of just chance in how the words lay?
No, I was definitely playing with it. I sort of learned as I went. At the very earliest pages I did, I was really trying to squeeze pictures in around the edges. And then there's just so much text and so little room to do paintings, and I started gradually figuring out that I could do, a page like this where, what you're seeing is I did the text first, it's all one page, and then the picture is painted around it. There's no part behind it. It's just imagined what's behind it. It's not like I stuck the words on top. But by creating just parts of what you could see, your brain fills in more of what you can see, and that's something that I sort of learned as I went. And a lot of the sort of punching the borders out to make more room for the tire on the left and for the right. I did start with the rigid format and then gradually started playing with it and breaking out and letting the floodwaters flow out of it and things like that.
Hi. I have a question about where you got your images from, or, did you find images online of certain events, or, and also what medium did you use to paint these?
I used gouache, which is sort of expensive watercolors, which is actually similar to what was used 500 to 1,000 years ago. And the imagery, the compositions I made up on my own, but then I would find pictures, just, how you find pictures on Google and things, and put them together. And, another topic I haven't talked about, another aspect to this is, I'm an artist, I'm not a theologian or an Islamic scholar, and, I think of this as an art project. And throughout my career, I constantly am sort of obsessed or preoccupied with why I'm an artist at all in the 21st century. And I think perhaps living in Los Angeles, it bothers me even more because, I used to have a studio in Hollywood, in a dumpy section of Hollywood, and all my neighbors would go off to work in the movie studios and TV shows and on the radio and making music videos. And then here's me staying home, painting away in an empty room the way people did 700 years ago. Like, why am I doing this in the 21st century? In the electronic age. And so I'm always thinking about, well, what is the artist's role? What can the artist do in our times to make interesting paintings that mean something? And what can I as an artist make that can't be made on the computer? And so the idea of making an entire illuminated manuscript by hand, every single page, was something that's, people don't do, they haven't done that for hundreds of years, really. And so that was interesting to me just as an art project, as an art endeavor, sort of.
Going off of that, I'm so impressed by the time commitment you put into the project, and I imagine that there must have been so much pre-planning and laying out your methods at the beginning of the process. And I was curious to know how long that took and what ideas did you try out that you ended up discarding?
I kind of did go on the fly.
Yeah?
Yeah, I would approach each page as it came and sort of ponder it. I would do the text first, which would take me a couple of days, and during those days I would be pondering it and looking things up and following leads and getting ideas and putting together things. And hopefully by day 3, I'd get an idea to start an image.
But for example, the layout system or the decisions you made about the lettering style you used, you basically made those pretty quickly and then you just ran with them and you never looked back?
Yeah, I did. I made it like a template that I would trace for each page and then go from there. And it actually turned out, I normally do big, enormous 6-foot oil paintings like I showed you early. And with this project, they were small pages, and I was actually able to take them with me places. So I ended up going with my wife, and now we have 2 kids. And we would go places for like art residencies. We went to Paris for 3 months and could take this work in a small thing and work on it there, and it's portable. We went to Morocco a couple times. And yeah.
Thank you. Most sacred texts are meant to be timeless, so I'm wondering, were you intending to maintain that quality in your images too?
Oh, that's interesting. I'm sure 20 years from now these might seem dated, people looking at their cell phones or something, but you know, I did want to make it now, our times. You know, intentionally, it's not showing Muhammad, it's not showing something from the past, it's not showing 1820, it's showing our times, as if the message was coming now. That was my concept.
The first part is actually a statement. You mentioned buying your book on Amazon, but you know, there's a table full of your books that people come up, which I bought, and I hope you sign books. Sure. But a lot of people are asking questions as if there would be resistance to this. That's sort of these roundabout questions that people are asking. Yeah. But it seems you didn't have resistance or people upset about it. Did that surprise you, or did you expect it? And I guess the second part of that, will the panels tour in the Middle East itself? Or have they? I came in late, so maybe you mentioned that.
They have it. You know, now that the book is out and that the big exhibition was up in California and it just closed, but it's going into crates, it's traveling, next it's going to Oregon. It looks like it might go to DC. We hope that would come to Detroit area, obviously for the Muslim community, and it's all in the process of the galleries are trying to line up venues for it. There are hopes that it might go to the Dubai Art Fair, parts of it or something, but it's all up in the air. But your other question is, yeah, it is sort of odd. It's so much of the discussion is people saying, you know, the unsaid sort of thing is like someone is going to be mad at you, but it's never the person that's asking the question. It's some imaginary person in their head that they're imagining is going to be asking the question. But I've never met that other person. Either they don't come to art shows, or they're indifferent to it, or you know, when people from the Muslim community come to see the show, they're almost always won over by it. When it showed in Iowa at Grinnell, actually, I did a talk like this, and then a guy stood up in the back, and it turned out he was the imam from what he said is the oldest continuous functioning mosque in the United States in Cedar Rapids. And he went into a 20-minute thing about how this was the greatest project he'd ever seen. It's bridging gaps, it's helping Americans. And when I speak at universities, you know, always, especially, you know, college-age kids come up and say, I spent my whole life as a Muslim feeling like an outsider and skateboarding in the parking lot, and now suddenly the two things are put together into one thing. And so the reception has been really good. Yes?
I also came a little bit late. But did you mention which translation you used?
I did. I used R.M. Rodwell from 1861 for mostly, but I also used Muhammad Asad and Thomas Cleary and many others.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Well, thank you for coming. Oh, here's another one.
Yeah, I was so taken by this book that I have carried it from the public library to classes 2 weeks in a row to show my students, because I work in residence education and help them understand social identities of people different than themselves. And I'm about halfway through reading it now because I'd never read the Quran before. So what are your hopes for how somebody like me could use your book as a teaching tool? I mean, I could get it there. I could tell my students why I thought it was important, why it was inspiring to me, etc. And you know, me and my students might never ever be able to see it in a gallery, so the thing that we will have will be the book to use as a teaching tool.
Yeah, well, I have the answer. Well, I guess, first of all, when I began this project, I imagined that the audience would be people like me that were Americans unfamiliar with Islam, and that I hoped that this project would be an opening of a door and then make you interested and go on to more scholarly things. But the best pitch I think you can tell to kids is, or what I've told people before is, I think it's an easy argument to say that in the past 20 years, the Quran is probably the most important book in the world, for better or for worse, due to the political situation on the planet. And for us as intelligent Americans to have no inkling at all of what is inside the most important book in the world is shameful, I think. When we're voting on it, when we're making decisions, when our country's going to 3 or 4 wars on it, just to have no idea what it says at all is sad. So, you know, just as you should have an inkling of Shakespeare and Chaucer, you should also know what's inside the Torah and the Quran, just for general knowledge, I think. And hopefully this book can be an entrance into that. Well, thank you. Thanks for having me.